While Israel continues its relentless war on Gaza, Palestinians pin their hopes on talks which have paused in Doha before resuming in Cairo on Thursday. Israel and Hamas are studying proposals from mediators Qatar, Egypt and the US. But what are the chances of peace this time? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I am Hashem Ahelbarra. A pause in talks for a ceasefire in Gaza, but no pause in attacks from Israel. 18 people from one family among the latest victims killed by an airstrike. The war has now killed 40,000 Palestinians, with many others dead under rubble. All hopes for a ceasefire rest on talks brokered by Qatar, Egypt and the US, Israel's biggest donor and weapons supplier. After Israel began its war in October, it took 5 months during which 32,000 Palestinians were killed before the US and EU finally called for a ceasefire at the end of March. Since then, Israel has ignored a UN Security Council vote, but international pressure to end this war is intensifying. The horrors for Gaza's people continue daily, while the nightmare of Israelis whose loved ones are held captive in Gaza goes on too. So what could make or break these talks? Is there a real prospect of peace this time? We'll put that to our guest shortly. First, Kulthum Sharif has this report.
In the 10 months since the Israeli military launched its war on Gaza, it's killed more than 40,000 Palestinians, wiping out 2% of the Strip's population and flattening most of its homes and buildings. For those who are surviving, it's a battle against hunger, disease, and for basic human dignity. The plight of the Palestinians has led to global calls for a ceasefire. But for months now, international mediators have not been able to agree on one. Now, US President Joe Biden says an agreement is closer than ever after the latest round of talks in Qatar's capital, Doha. Further discussions to end the war will be held in Cairo next week.
I'm optimistic, not far from over. Just a couple more issues, I think we got a shot.
Are you more optimistic now than you have been in months past?
Yes.
Why?
If I told you that, I'd give away what's going on.
When would the ceasefire begin if you can get a deal?
That remains to be seen.
The US, Egypt and Qatar say the latest proposal bridges remaining gaps between Hamas and Israel. Mediators have been seeking to finalize details of a framework initially outlined by President Biden in May, which he said Israel had proposed. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called on mediators to pressure Hamas to accept the plan. Hamas has rejected what it called new conditions from Israel in the latest draft. Dozens of rounds of indirect talks between Hamas and Israel have failed to reach a deal.
Netanyahu has said that he has no plans to end the war anytime soon, and that as soon as the hostages are released, he'll go back to fighting, and that Hamas wants a permanent end to the hostilities and an end to the Israeli presence in the Gaza Strip. So that is a very fundamental thing that has not been bridged at all, and we don't know how that is going to be overcome in this new deal.
On the ground, Israeli strikes have continued in Gaza, killing more Palestinians. On Friday, the Israeli military issued orders to forcibly displace people in central and southern areas previously designated as so-called safe zones. Israel's war on Gaza is also fueling instability with fears of a wider regional war. Kulthum Sharif, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Let's take a closer look at the ceasefire proposal that's been discussed. The first phase would be a temporary truce during which Hamas would release women, the elderly and wounded captives in exchange for Palestinians held in Israeli prisons. The second phase would include a permanent end to the hostilities and the release of all remaining Israeli captives. And the third phase would be the reconstruction of Gaza and the return of the remains of any deceased captives to Israel. Let's bring in our guests. In Tel Aviv, we have Alon Pinkas, former Israeli ambassador and previous government advisor. In Boston, Rami Khouri, distinguished fellow at the American University of Beirut. And in Washington, D.C., Niall Stanage, White House columnist for the publication The Hill. Welcome to the program. Alon, do you genuinely believe that a breakthrough is still possible in the talks brokered by the Americans, the Egyptians and the Qataris?
No, Hashem. Unfortunately, I don't. I am not optimistic at all. I look at the fundamentals of the deal. This is a deal that could have been done 6 months ago, or 4 months ago, or 2 months ago, or 2 weeks ago, and it still hasn't happened. And it hasn't happened for a reason. It did not happen because Israel doesn't want the deal, and it appears that Hamas is not interested in the deal. In fact, the one thing that Hamas and Israel have in common right now is that they don't want the deal. Now, let me add one more thing. In the graphics that you displayed a moment ago, Hashem, describing the deal, there are two things that are missing. In the first phase, there's also a 42-day, 6-week ceasefire. That's Mr. Netanyahu's problem with it. Now, the second thing leads to me being pessimistic about this, is that in that plan, this has nothing to do with your graphics. This has to do with Biden, President Biden presenting the plan, which parenthetically was an Israeli plan. There is absolutely no mention to post-war Gaza political governance, post-war, so-called the day after power vacuum in Gaza. So that leads me to very, very little optimism, if at all.
All right, Rami, let's break down the very structure of the deal itself. So it was based on the same idea that was presented by President Biden in May. Hamas came in July the 2nd and said they go ahead with the agreement, which is based on 3 phases: phase 1, 6 weeks; phase 2, 6 weeks; phase 2, 3, 6 weeks. Except that Hamas came out yesterday and said, we don't believe there's going to be a deal because the Israelis are not genuine about deal. Number 2, they say if there is no permanent ceasefire, complete withdrawal of Israeli soldiers, complete exchange of prisoners, and the right of people to return back to their homes in the north, we're not going to commit ourselves to any agreement. Is this something that could undermine any chances for a potential agreement?
There's very little chance of a real permanent comprehensive agreement, because I think fundamentally what the Americans and the Israelis call an agreement is very different from what the Palestinians and most of the rest of the world calls an agreement. The Israelis and Americans basically want to perpetuate direct or indirect Israeli control over all of Palestine, security control, economic issues and things like that, demographic issues. So it's very difficult to talk about this agreeing. You might have short-term agreements about a cessation of fire, exchange of prisoners and hostages. That is likely to happen. And the Israelis getting out of most of Gaza, the Israelis want to stay in part of Gaza, and the Palestinians saying, no, you have to get out all the way. It's fascinating. We hear less talk these days of the Israelis saying, well, after the fighting ends and we move out, we need to maintain our ability to control what goes on and who governs Gaza and security issues. That's probably being discussed as well, but it's being pushed down the road. So the chances of a real breakthrough are pretty slim, but the fact that they're still trying is significant.
Niall, the fact that they're still trying to continue the talks, they will meet in Egypt, could this be an indication that they are willing to overcome some of the sticking points, particularly when the Israelis are saying that we need to have some sort of control over the Philadelphia corridor, but at the same time would like to maintain checkpoints in Netzarim, the Netzarim junction, particularly to ensure that those who will be able to return back to their homes in the north have to be screened for the potential of carrying weapons to the north?
It could, but that doesn't necessarily mean it will be that. I think, as your previous guests have indicated, the really big overarching question here is, are these negotiations taking place in good faith in the hope of reaching a deal, Or are they really a shell game that is intended just to buy time and that won't change anything in a fundamental sense? So issues like the Netzarim corridor, for example, yes, maybe there is movement on that if you assume that both sides are interested in a peace deal. I personally think, yes, there'll be eventually, the fighting has to stop somehow, but I am not persuaded that Mr. Netanyahu in particular is interested in a peace deal right now for various reasons, including his own relative lack of popularity in Israel, the likelihood that there would be inquiries into the security failures of October the 7th, and the fact that he himself has engaged in this rhetoric of total victory. I notice he's been criticized by the Israeli Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant, for that, because total victory is one of those terms that can be expanded endlessly if you want to create a rationale to continue a war. So I think those are the kind of factors that undercut any belief that this is really a good faith negotiation.
Alon, if a deal takes place, is it good news for Netanyahu? Could it be his opportunities to somehow outmaneuver the far right, come back to his people and say, listen, I've killed Ismail Haniyeh, I've killed Shukr, who's the top military commander of Hezbollah, and I have the deal and I have the captives back home. Could it be good news for him?
No, hypothetically, yes, but practically, I'm sorry, for the reasons that Niall's just enumerated, it's going to be bad news. Because Mr. Netanyahu is going to face not just demonstrations and protests in Israel, he's also facing a criminal trial. His coalition is fragile. He is seen as responsible and the main culprit for the debacle of October 7th and the Hamas terror attack. In consistent polls, 70% want him to resign. Over 70% see him directly responsible, therefore he needs to be held accountable, something, by the way, which he hasn't done until now. Now, the war, the prolonging, extension of the war, enables him to distance himself from October 7th and feeds into his wild alternative narrative, according to which this wasn't just a Hamas terror attack. This is a civilizational war. It's a multi-front war. Iran is at the center of this coalition that's fighting against Israel. On the other hand, the world is trying to superimpose a Palestinian state, which is nonsense. No one can impose anything on anyone, certainly not at this stage. And so for him, he needs the war to go on. And, hypothetically, I take the premise of your question, or remark rather, Hisham. Hypothetically, this is exactly what he should do. He should say, I was let down by the military. I did what I needed to do. I stood up to world pressures. I even stood up to the American president. I killed whoever needed to be killed, in Ismail Haniyeh and so on. We have exhausted the usefulness of any military operation in Gaza. Now let's stop and do some recalibration. But that would assume a level of rationality of a decision maker that Mr. Netanyahu just does not have.
Rami, the deal is yet to be inked, if ever it gets a chance to be inked in the future. In the meantime, if Iran and Hezbollah decide to retaliate against the killing of Fuad Shukr and Ismail Haniyeh, would that change the dynamics?
Perhaps, but that, again, a limited short-term issue. I think the problem with all of these discussions about peace agreements and ceasefires and the day after is that they tend to zero in on today, tomorrow, and yesterday. They don't look at the bigger issue. Alon gave a series of very good reasons why he's pessimistic, but I think there's a deeper reason that the world has to come to grips with, and Israel in particular and the Jewish people have to come to grips with, which is the nature of Zionism. And this is really a big sticker item. It's not going to be resolved in a peace process, because as all of this stuff is happening with Iran and Hezbollah and Hamas and Gaza, you have the settlers in the West Bank burning villages and burning people in their cars. And this government of Israel and the army is protecting them. So you still have the late 19th century Zionist settler colonial process continuing physically, taking over homes in Jerusalem and the West Bank and other places, and trying to drive out the Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank. Unless Zionism is defined and contained in a way that satisfies the Israeli desire for their own Jewish state, which is a reasonable desire, but it's not reasonable if they put the state on my land and the Palestinian land that's forcibly taken from us. So that has to really, that's the big long-term issue. In the short term, of course, Iran and Hezbollah and before that Saddam Hussein, these were all issues that came up, but they tend to hide the bigger challenge that all of us face.
Niall, President Biden said that we're closer than we've ever been as far as the deal is concerned. What kind of leverage the Americans still have when it comes to narrowing the differences between Hamas and Israel?
Well, they have enormous leverage, but the question is, will they use it? I mean, you mentioned in your introduction about the degree to which the United States has underwritten Israel's effort, both politically and diplomatically and militarily. We just recently had the announcement of approximately another $20 billion in arms sales to Israel. So there is leverage there, but whether it will be used is the bigger question. We are just a couple of days away here in the US from the opening of the Democratic National Convention, which is expected to attract thousands of pro-Palestinian demonstrators objecting to President Biden and, by extension, Vice President Harris's commitment, which they have described as ironclad to Israel. President Biden has paused only one arms shipment throughout the past 10 months. Now, that's a whole other conversation in one way. There's some suggestion that Vice President Harris has been at least rhetorically a little more sympathetic to the suffering of the Palestinians and has said that she will not be silent about it. But to get back to your question, the United States has leverage. It has less willingness to use it, it seems to me.
Alon, there are many questions that need to be answered, particularly the one about what's next, which you've talked about earlier in your first answer. What's next for Gaza? We know that the Americans, the Israelis, the EU and many countries in the Gulf region are looking forward to new architecture in the region without Hamas in Gaza. Do you see this as something that could potentially happen in the near future if Hamas continues as a strong military faction?
No, well, Hamas is not a strong military faction right now. But what it does have is residual political power, amongst other reasons, because Israel rejected and is reluctant to entertain any ideas about a post-war Gaza and about the Palestinian Authority extending governance to Gaza, which, by the way, is the exact reason why Mr. Netanyahu worked so hard to strengthen Hamas. And if you look at it from a from a broader perspective, Hamas may be the Palestinians' tragedy, but Netanyahu is equally Israel's tragedy. And the combination of those two, does not lend a lot of credence to any ideas of a settlement. Now, there is one thing, though, that it sort of came up throughout this conversation between the four of us. There's one thing, I look at this after decades of being involved in these talks and observing them from the outside. You reach the following conclusion. The one thing that the Palestinians and Israelis have in common is that they repeatedly agree to blame America. It's always America's fault. The president wasn't involved enough. The president was too involved. The Secretary of State didn't come here often enough. He came here too frequently. There comes a point where it really is our problem. It's us and the Palestinians. And this needs to be resolved without pointing fingers at a certain president or a certain Secretary of State. And I'm talking about the last 40 years, not about the last 10 months.
Rami, could it be that because Hamas understands very well that any future for Gaza where they won't have a say means that if they decide to put their signature on this agreement for the ceasefire, it would be the biggest mistake they are ever to commit since they were established. And this explains why they are very skeptical about this whole talks.
I wouldn't go that far. too much emphasis on Hamas itself. You want to destroy it. You want to keep it out of any future government. You want to do this. You want to do that. Before Hamas became powerful, there was Fatah. There was the PLO as a whole. There were other movements, and they come and go. It's important to understand Hamas's relevance is not the arms it has or its position today or who leads it. Its importance and its power and its legitimacy come from the fact that it reflects widely in its political aims, not necessarily its means, but its political aims, the sentiments of the overwhelming majority of Palestinians and Arabs in terms of Palestinian national rights, and the overwhelming majority of global public opinion in terms of implementing international laws and legitimacy and UN resolutions related to Israel and Palestine. That's why it's powerful and it does what it does. They didn't want to run Gaza. They could have run Gaza years ago. They didn't want to. They ran in an election. They won in 2006. And then the US and Israel boycotted them, and they eventually had to take over. So I would look at the bigger picture. Why is Hamas still there? Because it reflects widespread Palestinian national goals. Those national goals include repeated offers to Israel to coexist in peace in a mechanism that gives the Israelis their national rights and the Palestinians their national rights. The Israelis and Americans have consistently refused to respond to at least a dozen overtures from Hamas and the Palestinian National Movement to do this. And so this is where I get back to the issue. We've got to define what is Israel, what is Zionism, what are its legal borders, its physical borders, and its demographic borders. And this is why most people today are so skeptical of the Israeli and the American positions. And so it's a big problem, but it has resolutions if we're courageous enough to get to the core of it.
Niall, when you look at the phase 3, which talks about a phase of perhaps 6 weeks that would then usher in a new era that could continue for from 3 to 5 years with a reconstruction of Gaza. But here is a problem with this particular phase. Here is where we don't have any sense of clarity. Who takes over Gaza? Who's going to police Gaza? Are we going to have a Palestinian Authority rejuvenated, reinvigorated to take over? Is it going to be Saudis having much bigger say and the Emiratis than ever before? Unless you get a sense of clarity, how can you put together an agreement that could just collapse in 6-7 months from now?
Well, yes, I agree with that. I think that is a completely valid question. The other thing is, how would a authority of whatever kind imposed by or with the acquiescence of Israel have any moral legitimacy with the people of Gaza, who have been killed in very large number and have had enormous suffering visited upon them? It seems to me that almost any authority that was imposed in that way would struggle mightily. The other point is, just briefly, if I may, before we get to phase 3, we have to get through phase 2, where President Biden has said there could be a permanent cessation of hostilities so long, and these are his words, as Hamas lives up to its responsibilities. The direct implication there is there could be a permanent cessation while Hamas is in existence. No evidence that Mr. Netanyahu accepts that at all. He continues to talk about the elimination of Hamas.
As we near the end of the program, I appreciate you can give me some short answers. Let me start with Alon. Alon, if there's no agreement, war continues, what would be the reaction of the public in Israel? Is it fair to say that because the majority of Israelis support the war, therefore there's absolutely no problem for them as far as the war continuing for as long as it takes?
No, not at all. They support the war and they justify the war in response to what had happened on October 7th and the savage Hamas attack. That doesn't mean they like what they're seeing. That doesn't mean they understand why it's taking 10 months. That does not mean that they see any tangible achievements. Now, per your questions, and you asked me to be brief about this, if the war goes on, there is a good chance or good likelihood that it would escalate. I mean, there seems to be a case of connecting vessels here between Lebanon and Gaza. The Americans know this. That explains some of their involvement, the idea that the paramount interest, not idea, the paramount interest of preventing escalation. Now, if there is no deal and the Americans are convinced that it was Mr. Netanyahu who undermined it, who made sure it wouldn't happen, who derailed a last-minute opportunity, I think that unlike what they have done in the last 10 months, they will stand up and rebuke him harshly. If that happens, you will see mass demonstrations in Israel, but you will also see major opposition coming from the security branch, the intelligence branches, the security branches, and the military itself.
Okay.
So this is very bad for Mr. Netanyahu if there's no deal.
Rami, are we closer than ever to a wider military confrontation in this part of the world?
We've had wider confrontations in this region over the years, and they come and go. But the fear now is that if there is a regional war with Iran and Hezbollah and the U.S. and others, that this would be bigger scale, causing much more damage than ever, partly because of the nature of the weaponry that's available, but mainly because there's a whole new reality of geostrategic balance. Israel is not fighting the army of Syria and Egypt and Jordan as it used to do before. It's fighting this new constellation of mostly Shiite, some Sunni, Arab forces mostly, some Iranians, that have created this tremendous new powerful force, the so-called axis of resistance. And Israel knows the capabilities of these groups. And the U.S. and Israel together have been, and the UK have been trying to stop the Ansarullah, the Houthis in Yemen, from attacking ships, and they can't stop them. They keep doing it. So that's the big question.
All right.
How do you neutralize that fear?
Okay.
And the only way is to have a ceasefire and a peace agreement.
Very briefly, Niall, if you mind, how do you see Gaza playing out in the U.S. elections?
It splits the Democratic Party, I was going to say up the middle. In fact, the majority of the Democratic base is now sympathetic to the Palestinians. That is not reflected in Democratic elected officials. And the danger is that that could sap Democratic enthusiasm and turnout, particularly in some key states like Michigan, which has a very high Arab American population.
Gentlemen, I really appreciate your insight. Alon Pinkas, Rami Khouri, Niall, Stanage, thank you very much indeed. Looking forward to talking to you in the near future. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem, Ahelbarra, and the entire team here in Doha. Bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.